Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the boldest ideas in modern thought. The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan didn't just say the human mind is like a knot, he said it is one. We're going to unpack his model of the trichotropous torus to see how he used pure mathematics to map our very existence.
So start with this question. What if the human mind isn't some open space we can just map out, but is actually a complex knot that we have to understand in its very structure? This was the radical idea put forth by Jacques Lacan. And to model this, he stepped away from traditional psychology and looked to a pretty surprising field, mathematics, and specifically topology.
He called this his topology of the subject. Think of it as a completely new kind of geometry, but for the psyche. You see, Lacan was convinced that to really get a handle on the unconscious, we had to stop using vague descriptions and start using formal, logical structures. As he famously put it, it is not with the knife that we dissect, but with concepts. For Lacan, the old psychological concepts were just too dull for the job. He needed a way to model the incredibly fluid, interconnected reality of our minds, and topology gave him the perfect language to do it.
So what even is topology? Well, you can think of it as rubber sheet geometry. It's the study of shapes and surfaces that you can stretch, twist, and bend around, as long as you don't actually tear them or glue new bits on. This was the absolute perfect tool for Lacan because it let him describe the fluid, ever-changing nature of the psyche while keeping all the structural rigor.
So how did Lacan actually build this model of his? Well, his entire theory is built on three fundamental registers. But, and this is the important part, in his later work, he doesn't see them as separate little worlds. No, he models them as one single complex shape, a torus, or a donut, with three interwoven aspects.
First up, we have the real. This is the dimension that's basically impossible to put into words or pictures. It's that raw, unfiltered reality of trauma or just overwhelming experience. It's the stuff that always lies just beyond what our language and imagination can capture.
Second, there's the symbolic. Now, this is the world we're all born into, the realm of language, of laws, of social rules. It's what Lacan famously called the discourse of the other. You know, the huge system of symbols and meanings that shapes our reality before we can even say our first word.
And third, we have the imaginary. This is the world of images, of identity, of the ego. It all kicks off with that famous mirror stage where a baby first sees its reflection and forms a sense of a whole, unified self by identifying with that image and later with others.
Okay, now here is where things get really, really interesting. These three registers, the real, symbolic, and imaginary, they don't just hang out next to each other. They are locked together in a very specific and absolutely essential way.
They form what's known as a Borromean knot. The three rings are interlinked in this structure of pure interdependence. But look closely. No two rings are actually linked together. The whole thing holds as one, but, and this is the kicker, if you cut any single one of them, the other two fall apart completely.
And this just brilliantly illustrates Lacan's key insight. He says the subject is conditioned by the pinching of the knot. What does that mean? It means our sense of self, our very being, isn't in the real or the symbolic or the imaginary. Nope. The subject pops into existence right there in the tension, in the interdependence of the knot itself. We are the knot.
But wait a minute. A knot is a static object, right? How does this thing account for the dynamics of our inner lives, for desire, for enjoyment? Well, Lacan brings the structure to life with a topological operation he calls cuts. This is how he explains the very origin of desire.
In his 24th seminar, Lacan lays out this double-cut topology to explain two of his most famous and maybe most difficult concepts. Jouissance, which is this kind of excessive enjoyment, and object A, the object that causes our desire. And you have to understand, for Lacan, these cuts aren't just metaphors. They are literal structural operations on the surface of the torus that create real, meaningful voids in our psychic structure.
So he talks about two basic ways you can cut this surface. Picture one cut going around the body of the donut, like putting on a belt. He calls this the external cut, or the E-hole. The other cut goes right through the middle of the donut, like you're spearing the hole. That's the internal cut, or the C-hole.
So why on earth does this matter? because these two different cuts create two totally different kinds of lack or emptiness. The external cut, the one around the outside, it produces the void of jouissance. That's that overwhelming, sometimes even painful enjoyment that goes way beyond simple pleasure. But the internal cut, that one carves out a structural lack that becomes the very spot where object A lives, the impossible lost object that is the engine of all our desire.
And this brings us to what is maybe the most crucial point of this whole thing. It is so important to get that this intricate model, with its knots and its tori and its cuts, is not just some clever analogy for the psyche.
For Lacan, the subject, you and me, were not a complete whole thing. Instead, the subject is the very failure of this knot to ever perfectly close in on itself. Our entire sense of self is built on this structural glitch, this inability to be whole, and it's defined by the empty spaces, the voids of jouissance and desire that this failure creates.
This leads to one of his most powerful, most mind-bending statements. He asks, "A mental knot, is it real?" And he answers, "It has the real of existence." See that spelling? Existence with an X. It's a pun, meaning to stand outside oneself. He's insisting that this topological structure isn't just a metaphor for the real, it possesses the very structure, the very consistency of the real itself.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. If our subjectivity, our very being, is this precarious knotted structure, what happens when we try to untie it? Lacan's model really challenges us to stop thinking of ourselves as stable, unified people, and to start seeing ourselves as this complex, dynamic, and fundamentally incomplete structure, held together only by the strange, beautiful logic of a knot.